your lunch. We will be diving straight into our next presentation, and our next speaker is Luciana Kiffer. She is a PhD researcher at the Northeastern University, which is in Boston, and she's going to be telling us all about consistency guarantees.
Thank you. Thank you. So today I want to talk to you about how to model blockchain protocols and then how to reason about or analyze the security of blockchain protocols. And there's a few things to think about when we're trying to model these protocols. The first one is, what do we mean by a blockchain protocol being secure? So that is, what kind of properties do we want these protocols to satisfy? And these are things that Sarah brought up, like consistency, liveness, chain quality. And can we use the same definitions for a broad range of protocols? So when we're talking about things like we heard earlier today, well, not necessarily a chain, but you have a tree based blockchain protocol or some other DAG-based blockchain protocols. Can these definitions be flexible enough to analyze different shaped blockchain protocols? And then what about the network? So these protocols, right, they run on top of the internet, which is a complicated thing to model on itself, but really we're talking about a peer-to-peer network on top of the network. So how do we reason about things like network delays? When we have some general understanding about, say, the distribution of network delays, this is very old data, but still mostly accurate. So how do we incorporate these distributions into our model? And then thirdly, what about the attacker? How do we model attacks on our protocols, and how do we consider both attacks that we know about and also attacks that we haven't even thought of? So how do we model any kind of attacker? So in this talk, I'll be going over a simplified model for blockchain protocols, and one that allows us to both give really concrete bounds on security and also capture what any possible adversary could do. I'll define what I mean by security, and for this talk, I will be using consistency here to be security. So again, if the property that says that we all agree on what the blockchain is, we all have a consistent view of what the blockchain is. And then I'll use Nakamoto's protocol as an example of how to use this model, and also show an attack on Nakamoto's protocol and how it falls into this model. So when we talk about blockchain protocols, there's really two parts. One is this pi, which is really the mining rule. It's what we're interested in. It's our base protocol, I guess our layer 1 protocol. And then C is kind of everything else that you can build on the blockchain. So if you have some sort of DAG-based protocol, and then C might be how you extract a linear sequence of transactions from that DAG. But for this talk, I'll be focusing on the pi protocol. And so when we talk about the model, I'm going to be talking about a typical execution of the protocol. So if you were to run the protocol, what is the expected behavior you're going to get? And in this protocol, we have what we call an environment, which basically models who starts off as honest and corrupt, and also some messages that I'll be talking about. So here in our model, all players are miners, and then you have some that start off as honest, running the Pi protocol, and some as corrupt, controlled by the adversary. And I'm also going to model the network as the adversary having full control. So if an honest player wants to tell other players about a block they've mined, they are going to tell the router, so the adversary, and then the adversary is going to be in charge of delivering these blocks to all other players. And the adversary is limited by, I guess the adversary can then control the order of how messages are delivered, but the adversary will be limited by some maximum delay that they can impose on a block. And so this is how you get the asynchronous model or the bounded delay, I guess a partial synchronous model or the bounded delay model. And so in the model, we have that our smallest unit of time is going to be a round, and in a round, a few things are going to happen. You have that the environment is going to send out the messages to all the players. These are transactions or whatever the players are going to include in the block. And then the adversary is going to look at everybody's state and decide who's going to be corrupt and who's going to be honest. So the adversary can choose who to corrupt and might have to choose who to uncorrupt so that there is a maximum fraction of corrupt players at any given point. And once the adversary has made this choice, now everybody tries to mine. And we model mining using a random oracle. So every player in each round gets one chance of mining, one call to this oracle, this h of x, asking, hey, can I mine at this round? And then they can make as many calls as they want to this verify function. So if they've heard about blocks, they can ask the oracle if these blocks are valid without having to give up their chance to mine. And then if the adversary controls Q players, the adversary is going to get to make Q queries to this oracle. And we give the adversaries a little bit more power here and say that they can make those queries sequentially. So if in one of those queries the adversary finds a block, they can then move on to working on the next block. They don't have to waste the rest of the queries on the same block while the honest people are all mining in parallel. So the whole point of using a random oracle to model mining is so that basically mining is like flipping a coin. Your best, the best strategy you have for mining is just to try every round. If you fail, try again. There is no ASIC in this model. And again, you can always verify blocks you've heard of without having to infringe upon your ability to mine. So to summarize what the adversary can do here, they have dynamic control of who to corrupt and who to uncorrupt. They have full view of all the states. They can make these Q sequential queries to the random oracle every round, and then they can reorder all honest messages, and they can delay honest messages, but they must deliver honest messages by some maximum amount. But they can always withhold their own blocks. There are no rules about what they can do with their own blocks. And so the parameters in this network are delta, which is going to represent our network delay. So the adversary can delay blocks up to delta rounds. We have the probability of mining, and this is in terms of this variable c, which roughly means that a block is going to be found every c times delta rounds. And then you have rho is going to be your maximum number of fractions, and then mu, your maximum number of adversary, or I guess your maximum fraction of adversarial parties, and mu is going to be your honest fraction. Right, so there are, like Sarah mentioned before, several different properties that blockchain protocols could satisfy. We're interested in consistency. And consistency roughly means that if you take 2 points in time, R and R prime, and 2 players, one who's honest at time R and one who's honest at time R prime, look at their chains, cut off some constant number of blocks at the end, their chains should agree completely. This also means that if you look at what you believe to be your chain now and then your chain in the future, you always agree with your future self. So it's sort of this common prefix, but with respect to time as well. So when we look at bounding consistency, we look at the relationship between the C, the probability of mining, and then the maximum fraction of adversary you can withstand, or the protocol can withstand. And so we see here this blue line, this lower bound of consistency for Nakamoto's protocol. So for whatever fraction of, whatever probability of mining you have, what's the most power the adversary can have before consistency is no longer guaranteed. So if we take Bitcoin's network delay to be 10 seconds, which is probably more than is accurate, then Bitcoin would be at about C equal to 60, so blocks every 10 minutes. And you see here that basically consistency for Nakamoto's protocol is it's as good as it gets. The red line here represents a delay attack similar to the 51% attack, and that's not going to happen when C is equal to 60 in this model. And then if you take Ethereum, say like 12, 14 seconds, then you see consistency is really only guaranteed in this model up to about a third of an attacker. And so here you see the relationship between sort of mining hardness and how much you can withstand an attack. And so if you have blocks coming out faster, you're going to get your C to be smaller, and you're going to have a less resilient protocol. Or if you have, say, bigger blocks, or your network delay is bigger, you're also going to get that your C is smaller. And again, you're less resilient to attacks on consistency. Or you have less guarantees, I should say. So how exactly do we calculate these bounds? So how do we analyze consistency? Well, to begin with, why do blockchain protocols even work? How is it that we ever manage to agree on a chain? So if you take a moment of time where nobody minds, say the last block in our chain is block A, we're all trying to mine to increase the chain after block A, and say at some point Bob goes and finds a block. Now Bob's going to tell everybody in the network about his block. Say this time is at least the network delay. At the end of this, we've all heard about Bob's block. We all agree that Bob's block is the one true longest chain in the network. But say that while Bob's block was being broadcast, Alice goes out and finds a block. Before she hears about Bob's block, she tells some people in the network about her block, and then now we have a fork in the network. We have this disagreement. And what keeps this from happening ad nauseum? What keeps this from happening nonstop? Well, there has to be some correlation between the network delay and how long it takes until the next block is found. So this is where we rely on an event called convergence opportunity. So convergence opportunity is a 3-step event, which we call this delta hit delta. So the first step is that you have delta rounds where nobody minds. So at the end of these delta rounds, we are guaranteed that we have all heard about all the blocks in the network. And then if you have one player that mines a block, then this is the single longest block. We haven't heard about it yet, but in terms of the global view of the network, this is the one longest block. And then say another delta rounds pass when no one else mines. Then by the end of these delta rounds, we have heard about the block from step 2, and we all agree, okay, this is the longest block, and we all have heard about it. The caveat being that we can only talk about what the honest players are doing. We don't know if the adversary is hiding anything. But these are opportunities where every honest player is going to agree on a block, as long as the adversary doesn't interfere. So in our analysis, we want to say that the adversary can only break consistency if they're able to interfere with every single convergence opportunity. So looking at a period of time, look at how many convergence opportunities do we expect, and then what can the adversary do with those. So how do we count these convergence opportunities? Well, we look at a period of time, say of T rounds. We look at all of the blocks that the honest people have found. We call these the honest hits. And the time between those blocks. In this case, these blocks are all found with more than delta rounds between them, so these are all convergence opportunities. Now, if an adversary wanted to break any of these convergence opportunities, what the adversary would do would be to insert one of its own blocks in the middle of the delta silence, making it no longer a delta silence, and so introducing sort of these little forks into the chain. And so what we want to do is count exactly the number of convergence opportunities that we get in T rounds, and then say that the adversary needs at least those many blocks mined in those rounds to be able to break consistency. At the bare minimum, it needs to interfere with every single one of those convergence opportunities. Otherwise, the honest people have at least one chance of converging. And when we're doing this count, we have to keep in mind that blocks may be found at separate intervals, and so we need a very specific way of doing this count. And that's where, So now I'm going to go into how exactly we do this count for Nakamoto's protocol. So this specific counting is really great to do with Markov models. And Markov models, for those of you who aren't familiar, are models where you basically have different states that you could be in, and then how to transition between those states and with what probability. So for our Markov model for Nakamoto's protocol, it's super simple. It's only 2 states that you could be in. State S0 is what we call the messy state. This is the state where you have no guarantee of consistency. Blocks are being found really close together. Again, honest blocks are really being found really close together. Everything I talk about is in relation to what the honest people are doing. And so to exit state S0, that's when you have those delta rounds of silence, those delta rounds where nobody minds. And so this is a chance where you might get a convergence opportunity. So once you're in state S1, if the next thing you get is somebody mines, and then again delta rounds where nobody mines, then you're converging. You stay in state S1. Otherwise, if 2 blocks are found really close together by the honest people, you go back to that messy state. So when we want to count the convergence opportunities, that's what we're going to count, this edge from state S1 back to S1. And basically, that's how we get our count. We look at a random walk on this Markov model and say that for T rounds, how many convergence opportunities do we expect? And we get our bound here, which says that as long as the fraction of events that are convergence opportunity is greater than the fraction of events that are adversarially mined blocks, then we are solid. We have guaranteed consistency. In sort of easier to understand words, if you look at T rounds, as long as the number of blocks the adversary needs to break consistency is more than the number of blocks the adversary could possibly mine in expectation, then we have guaranteed consistency. All right, and so now I want to go over a simple attack on consistency, or consensus, I guess both. This is similar to the 51% attack, except for we're adding in this notion of the adversary having controlled the network. So in this attack, what the adversary does is they delay all honest blocks the maximum amount by delta, while they secretly mine their own longer chain. So the whole goal of this attack is for the adversary to thwart the growth of the honest chain while secretly mining a faster, sort of more efficient chain, since they don't have a delay between their own blocks. And as I said before, so this is the red line that we get here. And so for Bitcoin, you see here that this attack basically doesn't work, because at 50%, like that's basically any attack would work at that point. But what the red line says is the probability of this attack succeeding indefinitely. But if you're making a transaction, you don't really care if an attack is going to succeed indefinitely. You care if it's going to succeed for 6 blocks, or 10 blocks, 15 blocks, however many blocks you're going to wait before you accept the transaction. And so what we do is we figure out a way to calculate the probability the attack lasts for any given number of blocks. So we did this with a slightly more complicated Markov model that I won't go into too much detail. You can check out the paper if you want to get more. But essentially what this is doing here, it's keeping track of, say, the adversary's chain and then the honest chain, and saying like by how much longer is the adversary's chain than the longest chain. So say S0, both chains are of equal length. And then say S1, S2, S3, that means the adversary's chain is up by 1, 2, or 3 blocks. And while say S1, it means the honest chain is growing faster. And here when I say honest chain, I mean like any longest possible honest chain. And so from this, we can calculate the probability that the attack lasts for some given number of forks. So for looking at 3 different values of C here, and say C is equal to 60 is about Bitcoin. And for a 49% adversary, you see that it's actually pretty likely that the attack lasts for a pretty significant number of forks, of blocks. But 49% adversary is pretty strong, right? So we can look at different percentages, say a 33% adversary or a 25% adversary. So for an example here, if you were to wait 9 blocks before you consider a transaction confirmed in Bitcoin, and there was an adversary with a 25% of the mining power, in this model, there would be about 1% probability of your transaction being reversed. So this gives us a way of being able to understand your risk when it comes to transactions, and maybe in a stronger model than might be 100% realistic, but if you're talking about the probability of, say, a large transaction going forward, maybe you want a little bit of a stronger model when you're calculating your risk. And so the other thing we did in the paper, which I'll go over briefly, is look at different kinds of blockchain protocols, not just the single chain. So we have what we call the click chain, where instead of having one chain, you have multiple chains that all reference each other. So if you're mining a block, say block 1 on chain A, you're going to have to not only point to block A0, but also to block B0 and C0. So basically you have this like clique of pointers that you make at every level. And interestingly, we found that no matter how many chains you add, your consistency lower bound is still the same. So if you, say, have 10 chains instead of one chain, now your blocks have to come out at 1/10 the speed, or I guess your chain is going to grow at 1/10 the speed, so your blocks are still, each individual block will still have to come out at the same rate for you to have the same consistency guarantee. So you can't just like add 20 chains and expect that you're going to be able to keep the same consistency. But if you look at that same attack, and here analyzing that attack for 1 chain, 2 chain, and 3 chain, we see that the more chains you add, the more resilient the protocol becomes against that attack. So basically, once you have 3 chains, you're still going to have the same like block rates over like all the chains, but that attack basically doesn't work anymore. That's not to say that there isn't a better attack for it, but but at least in this model, at least for this attack, it becomes more resilient. And we also took a look at Ghost, which you've heard about today a bit. And again, we find that Ghost has the same consistency lower bound as Nakamoto's protocol. So for the same block rate, you get the same guarantees on consistency. Not to say that there might be a better lower bound for Ghost that we haven't found. And so the delay attack doesn't work on Ghosts anymore because of the way that you're choosing now how to mine. And so we look instead at a balancing attack for Ghosts, which I think we heard something similar earlier, where the adversary is trying to keep the honest people power split between two possible chains. And it's a little bit more difficult to analyze. And so this is sort of a snapshot of what our Markov model looks for that. It's really like 3 layers of infinite chains. But what we're able to do with it is do a similar kind of analysis for the probability that the attack lasts for any given number of blocks. So sort of like what your confirmation time should be if you assume this attack is going on. So sort of to summarize that, what we do is we simplify the model quite a bit so that we can get these really concrete bounds on security, and then we are also able to apply this to different models of blockchain protocols, different versions of DAGs for these protocols, and be able to reason about different attacks. And if you want more information, I'd say check out my paper. And yeah, I'm happy to take questions now.
Great, thank you, Luciana. Are there any immediate questions from the audience? Well, I have a question. So if I've understood your presentation correctly, your model helps you understand the probability of certain attacks under certain conditions on a blockchain. Is that more or less right?
It allows us to also, be able to model attacks, yeah.
Okay, and then is the link to scaling that you would be able to change those conditions and understand what the security implications of a different protocol would be? Yeah,
exactly. Or if you be able to also use the model to analyze maybe a new DAG protocol that you come up with and see how it compares to other protocols using the same assertions, using the same model to analyze more the different kinds of protocols. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, well that sounds really useful. We have a question here.
Thank you. I'll definitely check your paper. It looks really cool. So you've talked a lot about consistency. Do you, in your paper, or do you plan to use similar model to analyze, other security property like chain quality or liveness? And do you think that you could use the same Markov thing to analyze that, or did you do it already?
Yeah. So liveness, chain growth is incorporated into consistencies. So part of the analysis there is we have to have some lower bound on how fast the chain is growing. So that's part of the model that I didn't mention. And then chain quality, you can do very similar analysis, but sort of the selfish mining does the Markov model analysis for chain quality. And we did look a little bit at that to find sort of the lower bound on using a similar attack for, Ghost is a little bit more difficult to talk about in the same way because you do have chain, tree quality maybe is what you're going for, unless you're still extracting one chain. But yeah, going on to other protocols is definitely our future goal.
I just wanted to ask, when you were doing the analysis and you had the little graph of the adversary's power and the number of blocks, is that just basically saying that the adversary can mine 9 blocks on average with some likelihood faster than the rest of the network?
Yeah, that's if the adversary were to start the attack right now, what's the probability that they're going to be able to mine 9 blocks faster than the honest chain's going to grow by 9 blocks?
Yeah, I was wondering, could you extend that in the sense that could you pursue the selfish mining strategy where if I'm 2 blocks ahead, then maybe I release a block, so then you sort of reveal your block over time as opposed to all at once? And would that have any difference?
So it's a different kind of attack. So that one is an attack on chain quality, right? Yeah. This is an attack on consistency. So this is making sure that we are not reaching consensus on what the chain is at this point. Yeah.
There's a question there at the back, and then we'll go here.
Yeah. If I understood correctly, your delta is the upper bound for a delay to reach all honest miners, basically, all honest nodes. So we're only talking of miners. Okay, but all, that's 100%. So, but normally the propagation is more or less a long tail distribution. How would that change if we make that, I don't know, 90% coverage or 85% coverage? Could that be incorporated into your model?
Yeah, so yeah, right now it is definitely a conservative estimate. But again, to get like really concrete lower bound on security, you do want to say like the worst case. But we are looking at how to maybe incorporate like the probability that the block reaches different nodes in a network with some distribution instead of just like one maximum amount. I think that would give us a little bit more of like leeway of work, because at least you can compare like some sort of optimal case to some like more realistic case. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for the great talk.
Thanks.
There's one more question in the back here.
Thank you for the talk. So I have a question about, does this model also extend to permissioned kind of blockchains? Or does it really require there to be proof of work kind of functionality?
So it requires there to be some sort of proof of resource. So the main idea behind using a Markov model is that you have to have the probability of events being independent of each other, which becomes a little bit trickier when you talk about permission settings or proof of stake settings. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Were there any other questions at this stage? Chris?
So you know when you talked about the DAG model, you did say something like you weren't worried about delays in this, where you might mine and like the adversary might keep hold of a block or not reveal it, right? You were interested in only splitting. Was that right, or did I understand that wrongly?
No, we do take into account the adversary withholding its own blocks.
Okay, even in the DAG model.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
It's just a bound on what the adversary can do with honest blocks. With its own blocks, there are no rules.
Great. Well, then we will move on to our next presentation, which is Greg Scular. He's going to be talking, so he's the lead developer advocate at Hashgraph, and he's going to be talking to us about the Gossip protocol.
Good afternoon, everybody. So thanks for the introduction, and thank you, Roman, this morning for the short introduction to Hashgraph. There are a couple of slides you might recognize. Yes, I'm Greg Scalard. I'm based in France. I'm a lead developer for Europe, or lead developer advocate for Europe. There are two of us in Europe, two in Singapore and two in California. And we typically connect with our developer community. That's the community of developers who are interested in developing on Hashgraph, or Hedera Hashgraph, I should say, which is the public deployment of the Hashgraph protocol or the Hashgraph algorithm. Consensus algorithm. So you can find me on these different channels should you want to. So I'll cover the characteristics of our consensus protocol really rapidly because I want to get into gossip about gossip and virtual voting. I figured this would be interesting to you as an audience. It's sometimes difficult to figure out what an audience expects. So I'll go into a little bit of detail there. Talk about some proof of stake with proxying, which is how we implement our protection against Sybil attacks, and some elements of what the incentives might be for being a node or participating in the proxy staking as a wallet holder, as a coin holder, and then we'll do Q&A if we have time. So the four things that we're trying to address with Hedera Hashgraph are technology, which I'll talk about today in more detail, governance, I won't cover, but we look to implement a governance on top of the public network that is truly world-class and suitable for a deployment of a public network at scale, and we'll talk about scale in a second. Security, we believe that a public network needs to be the most secure it can possibly be, and stability, again, if anybody is going to develop applications and deploy applications on a network which potentially represent significant value to them, then the stability, not the technical stability, but the lack of forking or the lack of splitting in the future for the network is critical to the people who develop on the network. So, is the platform fast? We're talking about scalability today, I believe. One shard, we can do over 100,000 transactions per second. These are micropayment transactions, or I should say cryptocurrency transactions. So 100,000 or more per shard. We get consensus within seconds in our testing. We've reached consensus at these transactions per second throughputs within 3 to 7 seconds. And consensus in our case is 100% probabilistic. There is no will it stick, will it change, do I need to wait for a number of blocks? We're not a blockchain, we're a DLT, a DAG I should say. But once we reach consensus on a particular transaction, that consensus is cast in stone, it will never change. And that's within a few seconds. We timestamp every transaction coming into the network, so we have fair timestamping, fair transaction ordering. These are determined by the algorithm, and they largely depend on the time at which they enter the network. There's no prioritization going on, and nodes cannot decide whether to include or not a transaction, regardless of what fees you're paying. Everything is done with fairness. And we have fair access in that if you distrust a particular node, you can pick another node to send your transactions to, and there is no reason why a node would give anyone priority, and suddenly you have control over who you send your transactions to. And it's secure. The algorithm implements asynchronous Byzantine fault tolerance, which some of you probably know is the gold standard in terms of network security, and this has been formally proven, or rather the maths behind the algorithm have gone through independent assessment with the Coq Proof Assistant. For those of you who are interested, all the results are available on our website. If you're into maths and into formal proofs, there's lots and lots of interesting stuff there. So, virtual voting. What do we mean by it? What does it? How does it work? And why is it so good? For me, virtual voting is an algorithm that calculates in a Byzantine-resistant manner the timestamp of transactions from 2/3 of the network or more. So how do we do this? Where have we come from? So voting-based consensus is widely accepted as being the gold standard, but it scales very, very poorly. Every node has to send every other node a confirmation of message receipt and potentially voting, and it's an n-by-n matrix of messages. It's only ever deployed in labs. It's not practical. It will not scale. So what Leeman Baird, our CTO and chief scientist, started working on in 2012 and realized in 2015 was that we can achieve virtual voting. And essentially, it has all the same principles or the same advantages as a voting-based algorithm, with hardly any of its downsides. So it's scalable, and it gives us a whole bunch of other properties, as I said before: fair timestamp, high availability, and so on. So that's what we're implementing in the Hedera public network. So, gossip about gossip is kind of the foundation for how virtual voting works. And so many protocols implement gossip. We have gossip about gossip, whereby we add some information to every gossiped event, which allows the network as a whole to learn what the rest of the network knows. And this is without every node talking to each other. This is as simple as me telling somebody, I've heard this from Fred. And if that person trusts me, and the trust is cryptography, is through cryptography, if that person trusts me, then they know I've heard it from Fred, so they know Fred knows. So if we were to then have an independent vote on whether 3 of us know this particular information, we all 3 of us know Who knows? Therefore, we can vote. That's virtual voting. So let's say Alice wants to send a message to the network. She first randomly picks another node. So these are all nodes on the network. In this case, she's picked Dave. And then subsequently, she'll pick another random node, and she'll pick Gina, and Dave in parallel will talk to Bob. And then Alice will talk to Ellen, Bob will talk to Frank, and Gina will talk to Hank, and everybody gets to know about the message. Now, if Bob and Carol at the same time want to tell the network something they know, they can do that. There is no assumption on synchronicity or times or time delays or anything within the network. It's entirely possible for Bob and Carol to send a message at exactly the same time to the rest of the network. And they do the same thing. They gossip that message to everybody else on the network. And very soon, the entire network knows about the messages. Now, you will notice, if I wait for the animation to complete, that the colored envelopes are not necessarily in the same order for all the nodes. They've all reached the nodes at a different time and potentially in a different order. But as we'll see later on, we're still able to derive the order in which they've come into the network from an outside party via the virtual voting. So, gossip about gossip. So we've seen how everybody's kind of sent messages to each other. So how do they know, or how does Alice know that Bob knew of something from Fred, and therefore Fred knows it? We add two tiny pieces of information to every event, and these are two hashes. The first one is a hash to the event below, the same vertex in the graph, or from the node. From the node, so the column, and then the one to the one above it is where it came from. If I look at the second round circle from the top on the left, the bottom line is to A, Alice, and the angled line is to B, Bob. And we also include a timestamp in there, which is the time at which that particular event was sent by one node to another. Now, if we look at the dotted black line, what happens in that conversation, so this line would be blue most likely, but I've highlighted it in dotted black. What happens in this conversation is that Ellen doesn't just tell Alice, I know of this. They then have a conversation along the lines of, what do you know that I don't know? And vice versa. And they then exchange with each other all of those missing pieces, so that they can all complete their own copy of the graph in their own memory structure, if you want, such that whatever Ellen knows, she shared with Alice, and whatever Alice knows, she shared with Ellen. Only the delta. There's no need to resend each other the same information. And if they both know about... if Ellen knows or hears from Alice that she has a particular event, and she already she only has the contents of that event, she only needs to know the hash from Alice or from Ellen. She doesn't need the entire content. So we only pass the very minimum information that's required. But what that essentially means is, through the gossip and then the gossip about gossip on top of it, every single of these nodes, A, B, C, D, and F up to H, and get to the point where they can build exactly the same picture of the entire conversation between all the nodes without all talking to each other. So they've achieved a view of the network that would be consistent with a pure voting mechanism, except that this has been done through gossip about gossip. What else? Yes, so that's... no, I think that's it. Now, so every node, therefore, has exactly the same picture that all of the other nodes have, and that's what allows us to do virtual voting. One thing I should say, if I go back one slide, when I say the graphs are identical on every single node, that's except for the very top layer. The last few events that have come into the network that haven't quite been gossiped to everyone yet, they're still in a kind of unknown state as to who knows about them, but this will get resolved as new events get put in. And if no events get put into the network, the nodes themselves will generate events in order to ensure that they gossip about stuff. So even if there are no transactions coming in, the nodes will gossip to each other in order to keep building that graph so that it doesn't just stop because there is no activity coming into the network. But that top level those last few events from the last few seconds are not really that relevant at that time. At the point we're doing virtual voting, we really care about what we all know down below. So every node gets this information. Every node runs the same algorithm. They all come to exactly the same conclusion, completely independent of each other. So even if you take nodes out of the network, they will continue to come to consensus independently. Not necessarily exactly at the same time, but they will all get there within a second or half a second or even less than that. What's important to point out here is there is no leader election. There is no leader. Every single one of these nodes are making exactly the same decision at roughly the same time. So that's one of the properties in terms of DDoS protection. There is no leader to take out. So how do we virtually vote? Well, we start by, we define a round created. It's hard to define everything without referring to other things. But we define a round, or a round is created when a supermajority of witnesses from the previous round can be strongly seen. And I'll explain those things later on. And a witness is defined as the first event in a round for a given node. So why do we define witnesses? Well, it turns out that it makes the calculations, we can limit our calculations in terms of the algorithm to just those witness events in order to reduce the calculation requirements to the absolute minimum. And we still retain all of the security and so on capabilities of the algorithm. But we don't need to do all the calculations on every single event, just the witnesses, and that's enough for what we're looking to do. It's also possible for a round. I don't think I have one in this example. Yeah, round 4. There are no witnesses in for Alice and Carol. That's perfectly okay. As far as the algorithm's concerned, we can deal with that. So, what's a famous witness? So a famous witness means that lots of people see it in the round that follows. So if we look at B2, and that will be done for every single witness by the algorithm eventually, but just looking at B2 for now, if it's seen by lots of people in round 3, is defined as being famous. So if we look at the witnesses in round 3 and we determine they can see B2, we do that by following the lines. So we follow the lines from A3 and we look to see if A3 can see B2. B3 is the same, C3, C3, can C3 see it? Through D3, through B3, B2, yes. So all of the round 3 witnesses can see B2, which means that B2 is defined as a famous witness. And that's what the algorithm does. So we will do this for every single witness event. We'll do this for every single round. And if in a given round we don't identify a famous witness, we'll just carry on until such a time as that event can be defined as being famous. So now that we've defined famous witnesses, we need to count votes, where we need to get to the point where we virtually vote on whether we can determine if those events should be taken into account or not. So we do this in round 4. So we're 2 rounds ahead of the events that we're considering right now. And what we define by strongly seen is to see them through a supermajority. And in our case, supermajority is 2/3 of the population. I'm going to touch on stake It's not the number of nodes that matter when we do this calculation in our public deployment. It's the stake that's held by each individual node. So the supermajority in this case is not machines, but the stake that they hold. And I'll cover proxy staking in a second. If B4 was to count the votes, can it strongly see A3? Well, yes, because it has multiple paths from B4 to A3, and it has passed through 3 out of 4 nodes, and it can count itself as one. So that's a supermajority. So it strongly sees, so B4 strongly sees A4. Now, if we move on to, B4 and B3, again, we have a path through the majority or supermajority of nodes, and it would therefore vote yes. Likewise for C3, and likewise for D3. So that means that having looked through, every single node does this completely independently. So we've got 4 copies of this stuff going on at the same time, and they've all voted virtually that yes, they can see A2, I think it was. Was it A2? Yes. B2. So B2 is famous. It's strongly seen by supermajority. Having done this now for a number of rounds, we've determined which events are famous and which ones aren't. So the green events are famous. The blue event, C2, isn't famous yet. And again, it may take a couple more rounds or another round or two before we determine whether C2 is famous or not. And that's okay. We'll just wait the requisite number of rounds. We'll run through the requisite number of rounds to define if C2 is or not. Right, so we now have consensus. Every node has gone through its calculations, has virtually voted on the sort of the famousness of the events, and has done so independently. So how do we now manage transaction ordering? So we look at the round in which, so we define the round receive as the round in which an event was first defined as famous. A2, B2, and D2 can see this black event. So this has a round received of 2. We then look at all the events that have a round received of 2. We look at we look at the we don't. We look at the timestamp that this event has, and perform a median calculation of the timestamp from all of the nodes for that particular event. Median meaning that if we have some significant outliers, if one particular node has introduced an event claiming it was from last year, then it will be discounted from the calculation being a median. An average would obviously pull it down towards that outlier. So a median means that we can eliminate outliers, and the medium timestamp of those 3 events that can see the black one essentially allows us to determine the time relative to other events at which the black event arrived in the network. And we can therefore put those events in consensus order, and the nodes will then execute each of the transactions in that same consensus order, which prevents us from double spending. If you've spent all of your coin in one transaction that's followed by another transaction that's trying to spend more of your coin that you've already spent, then that transaction will fail. The event will be received and be given a timestamp, but the transaction of removing coins from your account and putting coins into somebody else's account will fail because your balance is at 0. Through gossip about gossip and virtual voting, we've identified transaction ordering, and all through an asynchronous Byzantine fault tolerant manner. So Proof of stake with proxying. So we're talking about incentives and Sybil attack resistance here. So I mentioned earlier that the virtual voting is about calculating the timestamp of transactions and so on. But what's the network? So what's the network? It's not nodes. We don't care about the number of nodes in the network. What we care about is their stake. So a node will have an account attached to it, and that account will contain coin. It will also, anybody who's a user of the network will potentially have a wallet that will contain coin. And they can either hoard that money and keep it for themselves, or those coins, I should say, or they can proxy stake those coins to a node. They can actually proxy stake it to an account of their choosing, and that account can then proxy stake onto a node. And what that means is the node essentially gains additional stake from all of those proxies, and its voting power, when we're counting votes, increases as a result. So if in the voting earlier we did 4 votes, if every node has 1 stake, then that's we need 3 out of 4 in order to get our 2/3. But if one of them had a slightly higher stake, then maybe the calculation is 2 out of 4 instead of 3 out of 4. As long as the stake is greater than 2/3 when we count the votes, then we're good to go. And this prevents Sybil attacks, whereby if you create 1,000 nodes, you divide your stake by 1,000, and you gain no further votes. You're voting 1,000 times, 1,000 times more often, but with 1,000 times less voting power. What's also important here is there is no depositing, there's no locking, there's no slashing. We don't penalize anyone. In fact, if you proxy your tokens or your coins to a node, you're free to carry on spending those coins while the node is proxying them, or while they're proxied to the node. So it's more like an interest-bearing account. And as you can see, as an owner of coin, you get payments back. Our transactions will have fees, and those fees are paid back to nodes in order for nodes to kind of realize not necessarily a profit, but at least be compensated for operating a node. And if you've proxied some of your coin to a node, you will receive some of those payments back as a proportion of the node's own. So that might be an incentive for you or for somebody to proxy their coin to the nodes. And that's it for proxying. So in conclusion, Hashgraph as an algorithm implemented by Hedera as a public network achieves the gold standard of security with asynchronous Byzantine fault tolerance. It's incredibly fast, it's bandwidth efficient, it's leaderless, and it's going open access, which means it will be available for everyone Q1 next year, 2019, and we have testnets up and running right now. If you want more information, Hedera.com has a white paper. There are the COC proofs that I mentioned, the formal proofs on the algorithm. There's a Discord channel for developers, Telegram channel for the non-developers, hashgraph.org for education, gohedera.com. You can register on our portal to earn some mainnet coins, either through testing activities or development activities. SDKs and so on for the developers out there on GitHub, and plenty of videos online. So thank you very much, and I hope you've enjoyed the presentation.
Thanks, Greg. I really enjoyed that. Do we have any questions from the audience? Yeah, excellent. We can start there, perhaps.
Yeah, just 2 quick, maybe related questions. One is this, I didn't really get, is this permissioned or permissionless system? And on the other hand, do I get it correctly that besides the actual data and the state of data, you need, or every node needs to keep a state of every other node, like their view on what state every other node in the network has, and does that scale horizontally, basically?
Right, so permissioned, permissionless. So at launch, we're calling it a permissionless network. We don't do anything like everybody else, so we have to come up with something different. Permissionless in that if you want to develop an application on the network, you can do so without telling us. So it's a public network, anyone can use it. Permissioned in that to start with, we will have 39 nodes that will run the network until such a time as we're comfortable that the token distribution is widespread enough that we can open it to the rest of the world. Our concern, and this is, so Hedera is very conservative in that the public we're trying to address, we're wanting this to be $1 trillion worth of value transacting through the system, the layer on top of the internet, if you want, moving forwards. So we are being cautious, we're being careful with regards to security and stability of the network. And if we opened it to the rest of the world overnight, before we know what our token value is, there's every possibility somebody could take it over. So we are deploying it slowly until such a time as a Sybil attack is impossible because the coins are all over the place, rather than somebody buying enough coins to bring the network down, which is potentially possible at the very outset or the very early days. So that's the permissionless aspect. Your other question was, sorry, in terms of nodes knowing everything. So we don't anticipate, even when the network has tens of thousands of nodes, these will be separated into shards for various reasons. One is that nodes will have differing performance characteristics, and it's unreasonable to expect a Raspberry Pi to compete with a large system in a data center that has GPUs and so on and so forth. But we want to enable Raspberry Pis to participate as well. So there may be part of a low throughput, low transaction rate, lower transaction cost network or shard in the bigger picture. So inherently, yes, if we have 10,000 of nodes, as was mentioned earlier, I think one of the properties of an ABFT protocol are such that there is so much message exchange going on, it would get slower and slower and slower. But by sharding, we can partition this and manage the throughput and the performance of the network by keeping the messaging overhead, if you want, of the consensus to a manageable number, without losing any of the ABFT capabilities of the network.
Right, I think there was another question over here. Did you want to ask a question?
Well, I think in some way you answered that with the sharding. My question was more, how do you imagine the network topology to look like? Because a lot of your examples looked like it was a fully connected graph, and that obviously does not scale well in a peer-to-peer setting.
So sharding will take geography into account for stability reasons, if anything else. The minute so we talk a lot about, and one of the questions I'm often asked is, we're centralized because we have a council of 39 companies. They only have 2.5% voting power, so in terms of centralization, that's pretty decentralized to me. But centralization at a technical level is also where are the nodes located. So part of our sharding strategy will also to be looking at how we distribute, or what the distribution is of nodes geographically in order to avoid any potential geographical concentration. At the same time, there may be regulations that require shards to be in one particular geography in order to do some particular activities that can't go outside the bounds of a particular geography. That's entirely possible as well. So we're looking at lots of different topologies to address not just the technology, the performance, but also the usage, the use cases of such a network.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Greg. I'm afraid that's all we have time for. No, one more question? All right, a quick one then.
So just before you ask, well, I'm here and I'm here for the last 2 days. You can't really miss me, so come find me if you want to.
We'll do one more quick question and then we'll move on.
I would just like to ask if I join the system and I get some stake. Can I then choose to run a node?
So not for the first few years, no.
But then, yes.
But eventually, so we say 2 to 5 years. It will depend on adoption and deployment speed. But 2 to 5 years from now, you could very well run a node yourself, yes. And running a node, you would be earning transaction fees. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Greg. Okay, we'll move on to our next speaker. That's Mr. Ren Zhang. He is a researcher at Nervos and at the KU Leuven, and he's going to be talking about metrics for evaluating protocol security.
Oh, sorry, I have the mic already. So just like the title suggests, this talk is about multiple consensus protocols. There will be more than one. Originally, I planned to analyze all of them, but very soon I realized it's not practical. So I chose only 8 instead. You will hear about 6 of them in this talk. And it's about security. It will concern performance, but it's not, the focus is not performance. A few words about me. I'm a PhD student at Cozy KU Leuven, and I started this work during my internship at Blockstream. My hands are really cold. I feel really nervous right now. So, thank you. So I'm admitted to this conference because I was known as the guy who breaks Bitcoin Unlimited. So luckily, what you may not know is that the chief scientist of Bitcoin Unlimited, who is called Dr. Peter Reason, has another design, which I will mention in this presentation. I really thank him for the inspiration and constantly provide me with poorly designed proof-of-work protocols for me to analyze. So thank you, Dr. Reason. What am I going to do without you? So we all love Bitcoin's Nakamoto consensus. In this protocol, to resolve forks, miners are prescribed to choose the longest chain if there is one. And when there is no longest chain, miners choose the first received block during a tie. To issue rewards, it demands that main chain blocks receive full rewards, and orphaned blocks receive nothing. Is it secure? In Nakamoto's original analysis, it is believed to have perfect chain quality. Namely, an attacker who can choose less than 50% of total mining power cannot modify the blockchain with high success rate. And we all know that is not true. An attacker actually can modify the blockchain with high success rate. So what? So let it be. The problem with that is that the attacker can launch 3 kinds of attacks. There are more attacks, but we are going to focus on these 3 attacks in this presentation. The first one is called selfish mining. The attacker can gain unfair block rewards, and which is unproportional to the attacker's mining power share, which allows them to combine their mining power for higher relative block rewards, which damages decentralization. The second one is called double spending. In this attack, the attacker can reverse confirmed transactions and gain profit for himself. The third one is called censorship attack. In this attack, the attacker can, in effect, prevent transactions from being confirmed and becomes the de facto owner of the cryptocurrency, of the permissionless design. Let's elaborate on how these 3 attacks work. In selfish mining attack, so this red square means the time the block is propagated to the network, and an orange circle indicates an attacker block. A triangle indicates a block mined by the compliant miners. So the attacker was lucky to find the first block, but instead of publishing it to the network, the attacker chose to withhold it. And when the compliant miner finds a block, the attacker propagates the block faster than the compliant miner, so that all of the miners will mine on the attacker block instead of the compliant miner's block. And if the attacker is lucky enough to find more than 1 block in a row, the attacker can orphan an honest block safely. When the honest miner finds a block, the attacker just broadcasts both blocks to the network so that the attacker's chain is longer. In that way, the attacker successfully increased the relative mining power share in the overall block reward. And a double spending attack is quite similar to selfish mining attack. it's mining secretly for an extra reward if orphaning at least 6 blocks in a row. Because by convention, Bitcoin confirms transactions with 6 blocks. So if you have 6 secret blocks, if you have more than 6 secret blocks and you publish them to the network, you can reverse a transaction after you receive the goods or service. And the censorship attack is trying to orphan all blocks, not confirming the censorship request. So that I'm going to broadcast that I'm going to censor these transactions. And if you don't follow my order, I will try my best to orphan your blocks. There are 2 approaches to fix the security problems of Nakamoto consensus. The first one, we call them better chain quality protocols. These protocols claim that I can raise chain quality. This protocol includes, category includes the following protocols. So Ghost and Chainweb is analyzed in Luciana's talk. If you're interested, you can read their paper. In this talk, I'm going to focus on these 2 red ones. And the second approach is called attack-resistant protocols. These protocols claim that I can defend against the attacks under imperfect chain quality. I don't need to raise chain quality. And these protocols can be further grouped into 3 types. The first type is reward all protocol. So these protocols reward most of the recent proof of work solutions, and hoping that if these compliant miner solutions are rewarded anyway, the attacker cannot do selfish mining attack to invalidate their rewards, so that the attacker has no incentive to perform selfish mining attack. And the second kind is called punishment attack. These punishment protocols. These protocols, they forfeit rewards from suspicious blocks, hoping that in the fear of losing the reward because of the punishment rule, all attacker will abide by the protocol. The third one is called reward lucky protocol. These protocols issue rewards to certain lucky blocks based on the block content, hoping that these lucky blocks serve as anchor point to stabilize the network. And let's take a deeper look at these protocols. For better chain quality protocol, the first one, we call it smallish hash tie breaking protocol. In this protocol, whenever there's a tie, the protocol demands that all miners choose the block with the smallest hash, regardless of which one received first. The second one is called unpredictable deterministic tie breaking. The protocol prescribes that whenever there is a tie, everyone use unpredictable deterministic pseudo-random function to compute an order of all the blocks and mine on the top one, regardless of which one is received first. The rationale behind the unpredictable deterministic tie-breaking protocol is that as the attacker cannot predict whether he will win the block race with more than 50% of chance, the attacker is not rational to perform selfish mining attack. Is that clear? Okay. And for attack-resistant protocol, we choose one protocol from each type of technical approaches. For reward all protocol, we choose fruit chains. In fruit chains, they use the same mining procedure for 2 kinds of different products. If the first k bits of a block is smaller than a certain threshold, it is a block. If the last k bits of a block candidate is the hash of the last k bit is smaller than a certain candidate, we call it a fruit. So when you perform a hashing, maybe you will get a block, maybe you will get a fruit. And the protocol follows longest chain and first receive tie-breaking protocol, which is the same with Nakamoto consensus. For all attack-resistant protocols, we use Nakamoto consensus as their fork resolving rule, so that when we analyze their attack resistance, they are put under the same line. And fruits are embedded in the blocks. You can think of fruit in the same position as transactions in the Nakamoto consensus. And transactions are actually embedded in the fruits. And each fruit has a pointer block, which is a recent block the fruit miner is sure will not be orphaned. The banana's pointer block is this one. And the fruit is valid if the pointer block is in the main chain. If the pointer block is orphaned like the tomato, the fruit is no longer considered a valid proof. Sorry for tomato. And there's an extra rule saying that the gap of a fruit needs to be smaller than the predefined timeout threshold. The gap is defined as the height difference between the host block and the pointer block. For example, for this banana, the gap is 2 because the host block is 2 blocks later than the pointer block. So valid block receive full rewards, and valid fruits receive full rewards, and blocks receive nothing. And for punishment protocol, we choose a modified version of DCore as an example. In our modified version, we call it reward splitting protocol. Just like the title suggests, it splits the reward among all competing blocks of the same height. It allows a block to refer to previous orphaned blocks as uncles. And an uncle is valid if its gap is below the timeout threshold. The gap definition is similar to fruit chains, but it is different at a tiny little place, that instead of consider the gap as the height difference between the host block and the pointer block, in this protocol, the gap is defined as the height difference between the host block and the uncle block itself, so that we don't consider who is your ancestor. We only consider the height of yourself. And each block reward is evenly split among the competing blocks and uncles of the same height. For example, in this graph, this block B and block C each receive half of a block reward, and A and D receive full block rewards. Is that clear? Okay. And the last one is subchains, thanks to Dr. Peter Reason. So it also has the same mining procedure, but 2 different kinds of product. It is a block if the candidate's hash is below the certain threshold, which is same as Bitcoin. If the candidate's hash is below a certain, is larger than the block threshold, but smaller than another threshold, we consider it as a weak block. Weak blocks also count in chain length. Weak blocks also contribute to transaction confirmation. However, weak blocks don't receive any block rewards. Only blocks receive block rewards. Is that clear? Okay. So let's lay down the common metrics. I feel very excited about this. It's like, you all claim to be the most secure protocol. Show me what you got. So there are 4 security metrics we consider in this study. The first is called chain quality, which is the minimum percentage of compliant miners' main chain blocks. In this example, the chain quality is 3 out of 6, because there are 6 blocks in the main chain. 1, 2, 3, 5, 4, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Sorry. And 3 of them are from the compliant miners. And the second one is called incentive compatibility, which measures selfish mining resistance. It is defined as the minimum percentage of compliant miners' block reward. In this case, because of the 6 main chain blocks, 3 of them are from compliant miners, the incentive compatibility is 3 out of 6. Within Nakamoto consensus, these 2 metrics are equivalent. However, with other protocols, these 2 metrics are not equivalent. Chain quality is just about Byzantine adversaries, but incentive compatibility considers reward. And the third metric, which is another attack resistance metric, is called subversion gain, which measures double spending resistance. It is defined as the max time average block reward plus the double spending reward. So in this case, if we assume that each block is found in every 10 minutes, there are 8 blocks altogether, so there are 80 minutes altogether. So for every 10 minutes, the attacker gets 3 blocks out of the 8 blocks. Is that clear? Time average block reward. Because in double spending resistance, there's no percentage. There's no total reward or percentage of reward. And for this figure, there's no double spending reward because you need to orphan more than 6 blocks in a row to get a double spending reward. So in this example, the attacker has no double spending reward. So the last metric is called censorship susceptibility, which is the maximum number of maximum percentage of compliant miners' block reward loss caused by refusing a censorship attack. So if I refuse a censorship attack, if I refuse a censorship request, the attacker will start to orphan my blocks. So this metric measures how much, what's the percentage of my blocks you can orphan. So in this example, there are 5 honest blocks, and 2 of them are orphaned. So the censorship susceptibility is 2 out of 5. These are the 4 security metrics. Now let's show the evaluation results. So for chain quality, here are the 5 contestants we mentioned in this presentation. Gamma is the percentage of compliant miners mining power that will mine on the attacker's chain during a tie. So if gamma equals 0, everyone will mine on the... So during a tie, one chain is mined by the attacker, the other chain is mined by compliant miners. If gamma equals 0, all compliant miners mining power will mine on the compliant miners chain. No compliant mining power will mine on the attacker's chain. If gamma equals 1, all compliant mining power will mine on the attacker's chain. No one will mine on the compliant miner's chain. Is that clear? So that is a common metrics, a common parameter used in evaluating Nakamoto consensus. So of these 5 protocols, which one is the best? Yes, Nakamoto consensus when gamma equals, oh sorry, this is the worst. This is the best. So because these 2 are tie-breaking protocols, they only deal with the problem of a tie. So you cannot be better than Nakamoto consensus when gamma equals 0 during a tie, because when gamma equals 0, all compliant mining power will mine on the compliant chain, and you cannot be worse than gamma equals 1, because the attacker basically wins all ties. Of the rest 3 protocols, which one performs the worst? So it's the smallest hash tie breaking. For the rest of the 2, unpredictable deterministic tie breaking and gamma equals 0.5, which one is better? Okay, I will reveal the answer. So Nakamoto consensus is better. So why is that? It's because in this, for example, in UDTB, it's just too long. In UDTB, when the attacker finds a block, and the compliant miner finds a block and broadcasts it before the attacker, maybe the attacker calculates the pseudo-random function and realizes that if I publish my block, nobody will mine on my block because I will lose the tie. What can the attacker do? In Nakamoto consensus, the attacker is doomed because of first received rule, if you didn't publish your block soon enough, nobody will mine on your block. But in UDTB, the attacker is not doomed. Even if the next block is also mined by compliant miner, the attacker can keep mining on this block. As long as the attacker can win the block race with the next block, when the attacker publishes both blocks after the compliant miner's blocks, if the pseudo-random function says the attacker's chain wins the block race, it can still win the block race and claim all the block rewards. So because this UDTP allows a specific attack behavior called catching up from behind, it is not as good as Nakamoto consensus when gamma equals 0.5. And why is smallest hash tie breaking so bad? It's actually, yeah, it's very bad. Because, sorry for the, when the attacker finds a block and the hash is really small, the attacker has very high confidence to know that with 99% of possibility, no matter what the hash, with 99% of possibility, I can win the block race, regardless of whether I propagate the block fast. So I can actually accurately predict the probability that I can win the tie, which allows the attacker to withhold the block only when he's lucky enough. So the compliant miner finds the next block, and the attacker publishes his block and still wins the block race because the hash is small enough, and he has high confidence of winning the block race. And the next time when the attacker is not so lucky, the hash of the attacker's block is relatively large, the attacker can publish the block and claim the block rewards directly. So here are our general results on better chain quality protocols. No protocol achieves the ideal chain quality when the attacker mining power alpha is more than a quarter. So as long as the attacker controls more than one quarter of the total mining power, it can always gain more block rewards than the mining power share. And no protocol performs better than Nakamoto consensus gamma equals 0 for all alpha values. So you may perform better than Nakamoto consensus for a certain parameter, but you're not going to outperform Nakamoto consensus of all the parameters. Why is that? Because the protocols cannot distinguish between honest and attacker blocks. And why can't the protocols distinguish these blocks? It's because of information asymmetry. Because the attacker acts on all available information, which is how many blocks I have, how many blocks are published, how many blocks are secret, when did I publish these blocks. All kinds of information are available to the attacker. However, the compliant miners only act on limited public information. And why is that? Because proof-of-work protocols weak security assumptions. They try to be asynchronous. They prescribe that all miners only act on very limited public information. So now for the attack resistance result, first on incentive compatibility. The contestants are Nakamoto consensus, fruit chains, reward splitting, and subchains. Do you have a guess on which protocol performs the best? It's a reward splitting protocol, because punishment is always the most effective way to incentivize correct behavior. And subchains perform the worst. Why is subchains perform the worst? Fruit chains are sometimes better than Nakamoto consensus, sometimes worse. So why is that? Because subchains allow attacker to use worthless weak blocks to invalidate honest blocks. So if everything is valuable, the attacker is risky to withhold blocks. But because weak blocks are worthless, it worth nothing. Actually, the attacker can withhold these weak blocks without any risk to losing block rewards. If it is risk-free, then why not try more audacious block withholding behavior? And the more weak blocks, the worse the protocol behaves. So more weak blocks actually make things worse. So the best case is that you don't use weak blocks. It's an advice on parameter choosing to Dr. Reason. And fruit chains perform worse than Nakamoto consensus with small timeout value. Because the attacker can use worthless blocks to invalidate honest fruits. It suffers from a similar problem because blocks don't have any rewards in fruit chains. So the attacker don't have the incentive to publish any blocks because there's no risk to withhold them. As a result, the attacker can try more audacious block withholding behavior. And does more fruits make things better or worse? So by increasing the number of fruits, the protocol gets more closer to incentive compatible or not. Do you have a guess? It's hard to guess, I think. Okay. It's actually slightly better if there are more fruits. Why is that? Because recall that there's a famous Newton-Pepys problem. It says if you roll a dice 6 times, the probability of you have 1/6 is larger than the probability that you roll a dice 12 times and have 2 6. This is the general result. In fruit chains, there have 4 kinds of mining products: honest fruits, honest block, attacker fruits, attacker block. So we can think of attacker has timeout -1 blocks before the compliant miners do. Namely, the attacker can successfully orphan some fruits as a conditional event. This event is totally independent of fruit generation. This event only considers blocks, right? So think of it as the condition in the Newton-Pepys problem. It is independent, so we can throw it away. But when this condition met, if there are less fruits, the attacker, the probability that the attacker has more fruits is very low because of Newton-Pepys problem. So more fruits means more attacker fruits, because the attacker is the minority party. If the total number of fruits is more, that means the total percentage of attacker fruit is actually slightly more in terms of gambling space. It's closer to the expectation because when you have more fruits, which means when the attacker has more fruits, the attacker has less gambling gain, because you want to gamble when you have nothing to lose, but if you have more things to lose, you don't want to gamble. which means more fruits slightly contributes to incentive compatibility. And subversion gain analysis. The ranking is reward splitting protocol is for subversion gain double spending resistance, the smaller the better. Reward splitting protocol is better than Nakamoto consensus, is better than fruit chains, better than subchains. Subchains is always very steady. You can trust it. So the subversion bounty, the intuition behind this is relatively straightforward, so I'm going to skip that. So we analyze another interesting metric called subversion bounty, which is defined as the minimum double spending reward to incentivize deviation. We calculate the subversion bounty of Nakamoto consensus and reward splitting protocol, because for fruit chains and subchains, subversion is like free. I'm willing to, I can try double spending without, like with tiny amount of reward because it's risk-free to try that. So why not? But you can see that as the number of confirmation grows, for a weak attacker, subversion bounty grows like more than linearly, almost exponentially. So which means more confirmation really helps a double spending resistance. But it's less effective for strong attackers. For censorship resistance, we compute all the numbers, and the rankings are as follows. For small alpha, fruit chains is the best, and then Nakamoto consensus, and then reward splitting protocol and subchains. But for big alpha, reward splitting protocol becomes the best, and then fruit chains, Nakamoto consensus, and subchains. The intuition is fairly simple, fairly straightforward. For fruit chains, if you want to invalidate other minus block reward, it is a lot harder than in other protocols because they get rewards in multiple conditions, even if you orphan their blocks. But why is reward splitting protocol becomes better than fruit chain when alpha is large enough? Because in fruit chains, because they have different gap definitions. In fruit chains, the gap is defined as the difference between the host block and the pointer block, whereas in reward splitting protocol, the gap is defined as the difference between the host block and the block itself. So in fruit chains, winning a long block race forfeits all honest fruits rewards as their pointers are orphaned. If you orphan their pointers, the game is over for them. However, in reward splitting protocol, the last few honest blocks may still get some rewards. It's not enough to orphan their pointers. You need to orphan a lot of blocks in a row. This figure should illustrate the problem. In fruit chains, if you orphan the pointer, then all these rewards are yours. You're safe with these rewards. However, in reward splitting protocol, even if you orphan this block in a long block race, as long as these blocks are referred to in the main chain, because kin relationship is not considered, this block can still split half of the attacker's block reward, which makes it more resistant against censorship attacks. So some general results on attack-resistant protocols. Longer confirmation delay really helps. And more bandwidth consumption, if you use it properly, really helps. And there's a dilemma. We call it rewarding the good or punishing the bad. Sorry, it's wrong. Rewarding the bad or punishing the good. So flip it in your mind. For reward all protocols, because there's no risk to fork, even if you fork, you still get the block reward, so which actually encourage people to fork, which facilitates double spending attack. In punishment protocols, because censorship attackers, they don't care about their own block rewards, your punishment rule actually gives the attacker another tool to forfeit compliant miners block rewards. So it aids censorship. For reward lucky protocol, lucky doesn't mean good. If you don't break the information asymmetry, sometimes lucky blocks are bad blocks, which make things worse. And so in conclusion, we need to go beyond the reward distribution policy to solve all the attacks. Some discussion, what not to do. We shouldn't design protocols that are too complicated to analyze. We need to design protocols the designers can analyze. Simplicity is better. Complexity is the enemy of security. And security analysis against one attacker strategy is dangerous. For many protocols, they use a simulation to say that our protocol is resistant against this certain kind of attack. However, your protocol often inspires the attacker to develop some other attack strategies. You need to take that into consideration. And security analysis against one attacker incentive is also dangerous. To defend against this attack, you may facilitate the attacker to perform another attack, which has another goal in mind. The attacker may focus on short-term reward or long-term reward or damaging other miners' reward. You need to consider all different attacker incentives in your model. So what to do to get better team quality and attack resistance? You will have to read the paper, and you will have to find me for the paper, because I'm not ready to release it in public yet. Peekaboo. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ren. That was really interesting. We have some time for questions. If there are any questions, if anybody would like to... okay, great. Well, Patty?
Is subchains really that bad?
It is. I mean, how they advertise is that they still consider blocks as blocks, and they consider weak blocks as like free to synchronize across the network. But from a protocol designer's perspective, if your weak block helps contributing to transaction confirmation, you're actually a block. So we need to put them under the same ruler, not because your definition.
Cool. And so is the idea that you could use these metrics that you've identified to create like a scorecard for the security of various protocols?
Sorry?
Could you create a scorecard using these kind of metrics if somebody said, this is my protocol?
Yeah, I think that's possible. But I need more people to work on this because I don't know all of the protocols.
Okay, excellent. Well, that sounds like a really useful tool then. We are going to deviate from the program that we printed out earlier just a little bit, and we're now going to have Vasily Karin come back onto the stage, and he's going to tell us a little bit about Apograph, which I believe is a service that collects and curates scientific publications on blockchain and cryptography and those sorts of topics with a view to becoming a distributed publisher.
Instead of that, it will be held in that corner, so we'll have less formal explanation of what happens about the topography. And since I'm working in the research institute and I have little contributions in there, I'll just advertise it a bit. So the goal of the project is twofold. The first goal is quite modest. It's just bringing together the existing knowledge base on public key cryptography, distributed computing, and blockchain. That's pretty much the scientific papers which we have in our specific area, and to arrange some structure in it to make it easy to work with. The second goal is a bit more ambitious. So it regards our academical activities in general. As many of us work in academia, we all know what it takes to write a paper, to review a paper, to publish a paper. I believe that most of us will agree that the access to the scientific knowledge should be as free as it's possible, but in the meantime, the authors, reviewers, they should be credited for it. And we also all know how the scientific metrics such as I-10 indices, H indices, and citations affect the career. So what the second goal the project pursues is trying to unify all of it in a single system, which would provide easy access to the scientific metrics and the credits for authors and reviewers in the trustless, decentralized manner, so that we can prevent some strange self-citation, scientific mobs, and all that stuff pretty much everybody is concerned about. So we are open to ideas, to discussion, and if you're interested, just join us in the evening.
Excellent. Thank you, Vasily. So we're about to head into a break. After the break, we're going to do the working part of the workshop. So you're actually going to get involved in some really exciting things. Before we start, though, I'd like to say that during the break, it would be great if you could sign up to one of the 2 working group streams. So to tell you a little bit more about what your options are, I'm going to be joined now by Linus Gasser, who will be leading one of the 2 working groups, and Sergi Delgado Segura, who's going to be leading the other, and actually also Roman Olinikov. Is Roman here? Well, either way, we'll start with these 2. Working group 2 goes into working group 3 anyway. That'll all become clear to you at some point, I'm sure. Linus, if you'd like to say something about working group 1, which deals with the OmniLedger.
Exactly. Yeah, OmniLedger, Bitcoin. So I'm a bit the alien. I'm an engineer. I'm actually trying to take these papers and put them into code and then sell them to industry. So if you are interested, what it takes to have transactions, what it takes to actually put things on the blockchain, what it takes to actually link blocks and how all these things work, come to our workshop. You will need a computer with Docker and some Bash knowledge. And then we will create a small network, we will create some blocks, you will get some coins that you can share and transmit from one account to the other, and you will see how we prove that your coins are actually on the blockchain. So join us for workshop number 1.
Great, that sounds really exciting. And I'm sure if you don't have Bash knowledge, you can come and watch and still learn exciting things as well. Sergi, this is working group 2.
So the second working group is going to be about analyzing the UTC Crusade, as well, you have been checking me talking about this morning. So basically, we're going to use the tool I was referring in the morning, and we are going to access a set, check quite fun things, I think, like try to analyze some UTXs that are interesting in somehow. It could be either quite fun or a complete failure, so I think that just drop out and we'll see. The tool is coded in Python, so we are basically going to use Python and Bash. So you will need a laptop for this. But if you don't have it, I mean, I will just show up every single thing. So if you just want to come and listen, it's also okay. Yeah, that will be all.
That sounds great.
Thank you.
So during the break, if you could find Belle, who is over here somewhere, and then she will help you sign up for one of the 2 working groups. So we're going to break now until 5 p.m. And if the speakers could meet me just by the side of the stage here, we're going to do a group photo. So thank you very much. Enjoy your break. Belle.